Hello, everybody. My name is Guy Rubin. I'm the CEO of Ebster, and this is the Revenue Insights podcast. Today is my first day hosting the Revenue Insights podcast, and I'm delighted to be joined today by JD Miller. JD is joining us from Kantata as the Chief Revenue Officer. So welcome, JD. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Guy. It's great to be here.
So I think we're just going to jump straight in. Perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your role at Kantata, and perhaps a little bit about how you got there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have worked in B2B technology sales for almost 25 years now, starting to date myself. I actually went to school expecting to be a lawyer, and after an internship in the Clinton White House, realized that that wasn't the path I wanted to go down. And so I wound up getting a PhD in organizational communication. And what do you do with a communication degree? Nobody knew. But the first sales job came calling at a small .com in the late 90s that ultimately became Vignette. They were a web content management tool that grew from, is employee number 26. We were acquired by Vignette. And 6 years later, we went public with a $9 billion valuation and 6,000 people. And so I've spent the rest of my career really just trying to recapture that experience. So I've been through now, I think Kantata is my sixth private equity backed deal. I've grown through the ranks from sales engineer to individual contributor. I've been CRO and country president a couple of times. And then I also work with Five Arrows Capital Partners in London as their go-to-market advisor. So it means I get to talk to a whole lot of sales and marketing leaders at companies that they're invested in and think about how we get to be better salespeople and better go-to-market folks.
Wow, what a journey! That's very exciting. So you've seen this cycle before, and you've gone through it all. But are you finding the team these days are using any tools that are different, or is there a different go-to-market motion today with the latest AI and data available to you, or is it a lot of buzzwords and actually nothing's really changed?
I think a lot's changed. So, with the PhD, I always believed, the social scientist in me says that data is always really helpful for us. And we know, I grew up in kind of group decision-making research and how technology mediates that. We know there's a science of sales, and we know there's a science of how you get groups of people to evaluate products and make decisions and do different things like that. But I would say over the last, 5-10 years or so, the amount of data that's available to sales leaders has just grown exponentially. So, we used to have very basic things that we would ask sellers to report on, the character of their deals and the kinds of people they're working with. And now, of course, we have full access to all of the contents of the emails that are going back and forth, and tools that, record those phone calls and in real time can give you insights into topics that are trending and things to say there. So I think a lot has changed. The cycles have gotten so much faster in terms of how you measure, how you course correct, and then implement change and see the results of that. And I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future.
And do you see different levels of adoption across the different members of the sales team? I mean, can you tell us how big is the sales team that you're responsible for in the current business?
Yeah, at Kantata, I have about just under 100 folks in the sales and marketing team. So it's sales SEs and BDRs who are prospectors. And I do think that, being a company of size makes it easier for you to adopt these kinds of technologies. It seems like every day I get probably 5 emails pitching some new AI tool. And I think that the very small startups, which I didn't spend a lot of time in my career in, you could be overwhelmed with where do I spend my limited budget. I think the larger type organizations, tend to have money to do a little bit of experimentation. And that's how our own journey was too, is, through my career, I had sort of the core set of tools that I used. And then, every year there's a little bit of, here's something new. Let's try that. Let's do a little experiment and see what happens. I also think different industries adopt in different ways. So, I've always sold B2B technology. But across the course of my career, I used to sell to, law firms who are still probably, 10 years behind the tech curve. I've sold to consulting organizations, high-tech organizations are on the cutting edge. And, there are folks in the middle like insurance or medical device salespeople who are highly regulated and are more cautious in that. So depending on your context, I think the tools have a different time that they get introduced.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What we find is there's such a wide gap now between those that are kind of adopting this kind of data-driven approach and those that are still kind of very old school, where you kind of have to convince them that data is the future. So I'm obviously a convert and buy into everything that you talk about from a data perspective. But and frankly, what we're seeing is those that take this much more data-driven approach are kind of accelerating off into the distance away from those that are still kind of in that old school world. But we also see within organizations huge delta between the top performers and the average performers. So you see that in your environment, and is there still do you see a widening gap between the A stars and the V players?
I do. I think our best sellers are the ones who are constantly learning and constantly innovating. And, when new tools come in, the people who can play with them and figure out how to use them to their advantage, ultimately overperform. In my own journey, I grew up with social networking kind of technologies in the early 2000s. And I remember a time in 2003, 2004, Facebook was kind of new on the scene. And there were a whole set of people who said, I'm too old for that. I'm not going to do Facebook. I'm not going to, people who didn't adopt Facebook have been completely left behind. And even if Facebook isn't the social media platform today, we've learned through Facebook experiences and then TikTok and Instagram and all the rest of the things, that is what LinkedIn is today. That is what social selling is today. And so, in the very beginning, I think technologies come into play that you may not know exactly how they're going to be used or exactly the impact they're going to have, but really encourage people to kind of play, learn, and discover, because there will be gold nuggets that surface and ultimately just become the fabric of how you do business. And if you haven't picked up those lessons, eventually you'll be left behind.
No, I completely agree. I think what's interesting, we see that the AI and the technology these days is able to take away a lot of the admin burden from the sales reps who frankly were not very good at it anyway. And actually what we're able to do is use the AI to pick up that in response. But I still think, and what we're still seeing is certainly in B2B sales, relationships still driving revenue. And do you see that in your world as well? And you still think there's a very much I had an interesting debate with someone just yesterday where they were talking about the death of the AI is going to take over and so on. And I think the opposite. I think we still live in a world where relationships drive revenue, and I think the AI can help and can assist and take away the admin burdens, but ultimately it's still about humans buying from humans. What are your thoughts?
I fall on your side of the debate there. This is actually one of my favorite dinner time debates to have. And of course, I have a perspective in this fight as someone who, has a PhD in communication and works in sales. I suppose I'm incentivized to believe that relationships are always going to be, best managed by people. But it's curious to me how new technology innovations, completely transform different industries. And so, as a seller, I still believe that there's something really unique that can't be automated when you and I connect on a personal level. And that ultimately, I think businesses are made up of people who need to connect and engage. I would be more concerned if I was in a role that was, something that can be truly automated. I look at my developer colleagues and I think about how much AI writes code. And I wonder, where's the secret sauce of, people in code writing, which used to be a super highly skilled, really highly compensated role. But for me, I don't imagine that there's ever going to be a place where we just have companies that are AI, that, an AI product is selling to an AI procurement company. And I guess people would just sit on the background and collect the cash. I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but, constantly having employees think about what is the unique skill that I bring forward that no one else can do. But I think even outside of AI, that's a big way to grow your career in general. A lot of what I've done across my career has been bringing companies together. And at the time of merger, there are always people in an organization that say, at this company, I'm the expert in X, and I'm the only person who knows how to run this report. And so I'm not going to adopt any of the new processes. I'm going to pretend this merger didn't happen. I'm going to have job security because I'm the one who can press this button and do this thing. And I think, those are the people who get their jobs automated away really quickly. But the people who say, I'm the only one in the company who knows how to do this thing, and now I'm going to teach you to do it so I don't have to do it anymore. and I'm going to spend my time solving the next big problem that only I am uniquely qualified to solve. I think that's the way to build a great career.
No, I buy into that, absolutely. So look, let's start talking about what we're seeing, the attributes of those top performers within the business, and what you're seeing out there. So if we take the sales cycle and think about the top of the funnel, are there any particular attributes you're seeing that the top performers are doing differently to the B and C players?
For me, I think top performers are really about cutting through the noise with really measurable ROI conversations. When I first started selling in the 2000s, it was actually innovative when I learned how to, do a mail merge into Outlook and send 100 emails at once. Today everyone knows how to do that. And as a result, our inboxes are flooded with, copy and paste sort of mail merged messages. And so every year I look at the data about how many touches did it take for us to get a prospect? And the numbers just increased. That it used to be, I call you twice and you're going to respond back. Last year it took us 17 touches to get a prospect's attention, to show up for, an interest in a sales call. The best sellers are the ones who are figuring out, one, how do I use technology to be in your face? Because, probably 15 of those 17 messages are deleted before they're even read, or, it's a banner ad that disappears off of LinkedIn. But in that moment, when I do have your attention, you've got to follow up with something really, really valuable to offer that's going to be attention grabbing. And so I think about my own inbox and sellers who are trying to get in touch with me. And, I think every seller has learned that personalization is important. But I'm surprised at how many emails I get that just say, "Hi, JD, I see you're the CRO of Kantata, and therefore you should look at buying my product." A little bit better are the ones who've done some research and say, "Hi, JD, I saw you graduated from the University of Illinois. And go Illini, wasn't that a great basketball game? And now you should talk to me about buying my product." Still, though, the best are the ones, and the ones that really cut through are the ones who have learned something about me and my business and can say, "JD, based on research, I see that you're, running the merger of two companies, and it's been a US and a UK based company. And I bet you have this very unique problem that I know how to solve." And so I think the best reps are the ones who can, cut through the clutter with a really targeted message that's really about a real business pain people have, because that's going to develop trust and attention and get you to the next part of the conversation.
Yeah, you're aware that we actually met at a 5 Hours event where we were presenting the content from our B2B benchmark report, where we analyzed 4.2 million opportunities. And we spent a lot of time looking at the top of the funnel. And what's really interesting is those top performers are building relationships in their community, in their ecosystem, with people that aren't even in the sales cycle yet, people that are that maybe won't enter a sales process for another 12 months, but they're building up that momentum. They're presenting themselves as this kind of expert advisor in the room. So that when the customer is ready to engage in whatever they're selling, they're top of mind. And I think what's really fascinating, we spend a lot of time trying to understand how many relationships and how strong those relationships are with each seller and their community. And before we even look at the numbers, before we look at who's closed won and lost deals, when you start to see there's usually 5 or 10% of the AEs that have got more relationships than everybody else. When we trawl through their historical mailboxes and calendars, you can see that they kind of hold 2 or 3 times more relationships than everybody else. And it ran true in the data. What we saw was that the top performers are twice as likely to self-source their own opportunities than the B and C players. So it does show us that relationships are vital, even in today's market, to driving that. So as we move down the side of the funnel, we start thinking about qualification and discovery. Are you seeing anything that the top performers are doing differently to everybody else?
Yeah, I think, again, it's about, listening more than you talk and learning from what you hear. So I had a sales coach, and we've all heard this before, you got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you talk. But really understanding that even though this might be the 100th time I'm pitching my product, your circumstance is unique. And for you, you think it's especially unique. And so how can I really listen to the clues you're giving me, the things that you're telling me are important, and then tailoring my message back to that? And the great performers, as they move through the sales cycle, are constantly adapting their messaging and responding. So it's learning who else is involved and what are the things that are going to get in the way of progressing this deal forward, and what are the biggest priorities. And I think a lot of times, sellers sit and they're just waiting for you to stop talking so I can say my next canned thing. The biggest skill is actually sitting and listening and truly responding and engaging with what you just told me?
Yeah, it's difficult, right? Because you kind of, you know the solution because you've got it in the back of your mind, right? And all you want to do is say, don't worry, I can fix that problem you just mentioned. But actually, the best sellers are the ones that will dig further and really try and understand the requirements in a lot more detail. And most importantly, the impact of that requirement. If we fix that problem, so what? Do you get a promotion? Does the business grow faster? How does that problem compare to the other 7 problems that you're also working on at the moment? Because I think that what we're seeing, again, we analyzed over 1 million hours worth of sales calls last year. And what we see is that the top performers present themselves as this expert advisor and almost reach a consensus with the buyer as to whether this is a process we should continue on together. Because both your time and the buyer's time is valuable. And we should be able to reach a consensus as to whether this is really a priority, that there really is a budget for, that we really want to go through this cycle with. And if there is, I'm in. But if there's not, then, with respect, where I am. And, when this challenge becomes your number one priority, then we'll re-engage. So versus the average performers who just want to jump in and show pictures, they're super keen to get under this and they kind of present themselves as this kind of annoying salesperson rather than this expert advisor.
Absolutely agree. We just had a training with our sellers around what we're calling the joint engagement plan. And on the surface, it sounds a lot like something you've been trained in that's called the close plan. But when you call it a close plan, it's really about what I as a seller am doing to you as a company. And actually, that switch in wording, that it's a joint engagement plan or a joint evaluation plan, is exactly what you just said, is how do I make that sales motion something that you and I are collaborating around and starting the conversation with, you may not buy from me, you may not ultimately think my solution is right, but how do we agree about the steps that we're going to go through to get to that answer? If we can together sort of document and decide, here's the roadmap, that first you're going to do this, and these are the people that are going to be involved, and here's when we're going to reach a decision point, and if we're selected, how we'd move through your discovery process. It actually does help you be a better seller too, because all of a sudden you really know who are the people involved and what date is this really going to close. It's probably not going to close on July 30th. It's going to be, some random day because we always meet on the second Tuesday with our board or that kind of stuff. It just makes you really much more effective when you think about collaborating with your prospect. And also, it's amazing to me how fast the last 25 years of selling have gone for me. But I'm really thrilled that over 25 years, I have people who have come back to me again and again as I've moved from company to company to company, because we're trying to build reputations as professional salespeople of people who solve problems, not someone who tricked you into buying something that, was good for me in that moment, but not in the long term.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And we see that data, right? So the very best sellers we found are closing off 30% of their opportunities at the discovery stage. And the B and C players are scared to do that, right? And arguably as sales leaders, we perhaps we tar everyone with the same brush, and we have to be conscious of the fact that different salespeople need different levels of coverage to hit their quota. And it's actually okay to close off opportunities as lost earlier, because it will allow us to focus on the right deals at the right time. And I think that's really important that we kind of support our sellers and recognize that not everyone is kind of at A-star level yet. And we can help them to get there by really prompting them as to what they should be doing. And one of the things that hit me recently is how limited a lot of salespeople's capacity is for learning. And we only have so much capacity to teach them things. And we need to be very careful about what we choose to spend time with them on. And things that the AI can't do. We waste so much energy teaching salespeople how to manually fill in the meg pick or how to manually update their records, when in fact the AI can do all of that for them. And really what they need training on is, how do I deal with objection handling? And how do I build out that, what did you call it? I prefer that than the close plan. You
joint engagement plan, yes.
A joint engagement plan, exactly, right? That's something the AI can't do for us, right? And if we can teach the salespeople how they can be perceived as that expert advisor, one of the things we've built our business on is this idea, this North Star metric around engagement. And really understanding, we see time and again that deals are closed at a much higher win rate when the engagement is high. So the next obvious question is, well, maybe it's just a factor of, when you win a deal, the engagement happens to be high, but it's not that the top performers are wanting more engagement with the customers and the B and C players aren't willing to go that extra mile or spend more time with the customer. It's more that the customer doesn't want to spend time with the B and C players because they're just selling at them. They're just showing them features. While the A players happen to have such high levels of engagement with the customer because they are seen as this expert advisor that can help the customer through this complex journey that they need to go through. And so that engagement metric is really fascinating. It's not that the B and C players don't want to engage with the customer. It's that they've not positioned themselves in a place where the customer wants to spend time with them.
Well, and I like what you just said about sort of just-in-time learning as well. I think 20 years ago, people would go to work for, IBM or any of those big companies, and they'd send you off for 2 weeks of training, and you would swallow the whole book and then come back, and it was like, well, now you know how to sell, using our process. And today, that's not how people learn. I mean, I don't know if that's how people learned before, but people don't want to learn that way today. And yet the social scientist in me tells me that processes like MedPick are there for a reason, because we know that deals will happen when you have identified the economic buyer, the paper process or those things. So the trick for me is, how do I get across, all of my sellers and the thousands of interactions we're having, and identify what are the skills that my sellers are missing today? So, we've just migrated through a new call recording software that, transcribes and records. We have 1.4 million sales calls recorded in our database. And now AI makes it really easy to kind of overlay MedPick on top and say, okay, in the last 90 days, how many of them were missing which piece of MedPick? Because that's the skill that I need to train on next. And then getting even more nuanced, fine, we've identified we've got to do training on getting the economic buyer to the table. Then you can look at, what are the questions, what are the things that make us more likely to reach that person or less likely? So you can get really granular, targeted training on a person level that says, ask this question in this way, or ask this open-ended question, or, whatever it is, and deliver that training for real-time results, which I think is really exciting.
No, I agree. And we recently introduced those features as well. And it's amazing how you can analyze, get so much insights from those call recordings from the past. And you can really laser focus some of the training, which is very exciting. One of the other questions I wanted to ask you about when you're running a sales team of 100 people is planning. So, and really forecasting into the future, and how you've gone through that. Now you've done it a number of times over a number of years at a number of different businesses. Can you share with us the process that you go through kind of towards the end of or the beginning of your financial year, and then how often you revisit those plans?
Yeah, actually, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So as we're getting ready for this podcast, I'm also just finishing a book I'm calling it, the CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. And as I've been writing through the book, I realized, the biggest chapter has been about annual planning. And it gets to this notion that you and I just talked about, which is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so, looking at the data to say what has happened is the fastest way for you to figure out what's going to go forward. And I think a lot of CROs make or break their year when they set the annual plan. I've seen a lot of CROs sign up for an annual plan that says, well, the board wants 20% growth from us, so I'm just going to assign 20% more quota, or I'm going to hire 20% more people, or, I'm just going to put it on a piece of paper and hope that it works. And actually, when you're
wrong,
exactly right. But it's surprising how many people do that, right? And so, for me, the annual planning process starts with this huge data analysis of like, what was the average deal cycle? How long did a typical deal take? What was the average deal size? Team by team or seller by seller, what was their win rate? And what does turnover look like in those teams? And so let's just fast forward a year. If nothing changes, based on the leads we generate and the people, how many people are going to leave? How long is it going to take for the next person to come up to speed and reach that level of productivity? And what's their average deal going to be? And that can give you a really clear forecast of what next year looks like. And of course, your PE investor then will say, yes, but I need 20% growth and you've only gotten me, 8% of it or 12% of it. But that's really when the fun part comes in of you've got to start deciding, okay, so what are the bets we're going to make? Am I going to buy a tool like yours? Am I going to do a sales training? Am I going to, shift my marketing message upstream and try and get, 10% bigger deals or things like that? But you've got to build all of those into the plan as explicit assumptions that then month by month you can look at, I made these bets under the assumption this was going to happen. Is it or isn't it? And then be able to course correct on that. And I think when we do that, it makes us run better businesses, but it also gives you a lot of credibility to be able to stand up in front of your individual seller and not just say, I gave you this quota, good luck with it. but actually give them a roadmap to success that said, I built a plan that said, based in the past, here's what you were able to accomplish. This year, you'll make your number if you can get 3 deals of this size and 2 deals of this size and 1 of that size. And, the roadmap to get there is this many calls, this many things. Look at your territory. Here's where, there are 100 of those potential opportunities. You only need to get 3 of that, all of that kind of stuff. So that we're not running our teams based on hope, but we actually have a real plan grounded in reality.
That makes a lot of sense. And so how did you do? When was your year end and how close were you to get out in the beginning?
Yeah. So last year was the end of my first year at Kantata. And one of the hallmarks that I think of the leadership I've had in lots of teams is we always deliver the plan that we commit to. And, I may show up at a board meeting sometime and say, I can't reach what we want to do, and here's why. But let's decide that in the beginning of the year and adapt so that, ultimately we're going to get where we want to go. There's a really scary statistic that the typical head of sales lasts in seat 18 months, and then they turn over the head of sales, at least in tech companies. And I don't think that those CROs and those VPs are losing their jobs because they didn't hit the number. It's because they didn't predict that they were not going to hit the number. And so, I've always outlived that 18-month tenure because I've been able to ground it in reality, ground it in data, say, here's what's going to happen. Here's what is happening, whether we like it or not. Now we can engage in a discussion about what to do about it instead of just having board meeting after board meeting saying we're missing, we don't know why. And I don't have a plan that's going to help us get out of the hole we're in.
And how often do you revisit the plan?
I really believe in inspect what you expect. And so I'm looking at the plan weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually. So, on a quarterly basis, of course, we're always having a board meeting where we're looking at how did the last quarter finish compared to where we want it to be. Most PE firms I've worked with also, we're having a monthly review of how did this particular month compare to what we expected. But that's the output. That's after all the work is done. And so my teams are always really focused on what are the leading indicators. We don't have to wait till the end of the month to know, are we going to hit the number or not? Because we know our typical deal cycle is 4 months long for our mid-market teams, 6 months long for our enterprise teams. And so 6 months ago, we knew, did we create enough pipeline? Did we do the right things that are going to, get us there? And so I have a great sales ops team that produces, we call it the weekly flash report. That's lead gen and deal velocity stuff that says, according to the plan, if we're going to hit this number, we need to have developed this much pipeline on these particular, week by week by week. We need to have seen this kind of progression happening. And so did we achieve this week's numbers that are ultimately going to feed an outcome months into the future? And if not, then let's dive into the tapes and let's ask the AI, like, how do we course correct, or what's the skill that's missing that's gonna make that different for us?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then when you're thinking about the next year, when do you start that planning exercise, or is it just an ongoing process, or is there a kind of 2 or 3 months before, are you kind of taking some time out to kind of think about the year ahead?
I like to start the full year annual plan towards the end of the third quarter so that we have a sense of how things are going this year. We have a sense of the strategies that are working or not. We spend the third quarter kind of building the plan, looking forward. We're presenting it and discussing it with the board through the fourth quarter. Often that's tied to discussions about investments we're going to make, to close the gap, or, products we're going to buy or training we're going to do, or any of that stuff. And I also think it's really important then to be able to come out the gate on the very first day of the new year, communicating it to everyone. I hate sales organizations that have sellers that, didn't get their quota until February, or they don't know what their comp plan is. So I like on the very first day to be able to look every seller in the eye and say, here's the expectation. Here's how we think you get there. This is the territory. Here's your commission, rules of engagement, all the rules we're going to play by, and go off and go. I don't like to do it a day earlier because I don't want people to game the system and say, oh, this deal, it'll be better under next year's terms and I'll wait. But having it all lined up in those last weeks of the fourth quarter so you can press send on it the start of the first day is my nirvana.
Salespeople sandbagging? I don't think that's a thing anymore, surely. You spoke earlier about some of the latest AI technology that you're quite excited about, the way that call recordings and transcripts can be used to pre-populate things like NetPick in Salesforce. Are there any other technologies or projects that you've got coming up that are really exciting you at the moment?
Yes, I'm really actually getting excited about another data analysis product, which is understanding our target markets better. It's a curious time for us. Kantata is, we sell solutions for professional services organizations, so consulting organizations. And there's a lot of discussion in that space right now of, is the economy good or is the economy bad? You see the consumer spending data that says the economy's booming, but you see sentiment data that says, people are very nervous about spending money and maybe we're headed into a recession. So we're doing a lot of work right now, really trying to understand the sentiment of our customers and our prospects. And again, I think AI is helpful here because today, different than ever before, we've got both structured and unstructured data that we can look at. And so you can look at all the typical kind of Wall Street data and, earnings reports and all of that to get kind of quantitative data. But then you've got all this qualitative data around, what are people tweeting about and what are people writing about? And, again, what are people saying on your calls that give you sort of an indication of how our prospects are feeling, what are the biggest problems they're trying to solve. And then that can inform for us new product development. It can inform messaging. It can inform M&A strategy on, how do we fill gaps in different places? So, I think that's again, one of these projects that's never ending, but at this point in time, has more possibility than I think I've ever seen in my career.
Very good. Well, look, JD, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. If the community want to reach out and ask you anything specifically, is there somewhere they can connect with you?
Absolutely. So the best is my personal website, which is jdmillerphd.com, just JDMILLER. phd.com, or you'll find me on LinkedIn at LinkedIn/JDMillerPhD.
Very good. Well, JD, thank you so much for sharing your insights, and looking forward to spending some more time with you. And I'm sure our community will love the session we just run. So thanks again. Yeah, I appreciate you coming onto the podcast.
Absolutely, Guy. Thanks for having me.